kinds of bias. So of course, there was the old colonial bias, but then we accumulated on top of that the Marxist bias, then Nehruvian biases, and so on. And the net result of all of that is that the history that we now have has become so contested, and any attempt to try and now change it becomes so political, that I think we now really need to begin to go literally back to looking at the original primary evidence in some way and begin to rethink this. This is important, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, because there is a problem even in the way we look at our primary evidence, but this primary evidence is not set in stone. We are continuously accumulating new primary evidence from excavations, from new genetic data, from data for climate change, and so on. So the idea here is that history is not a narrative which is definitely true for all time. History is a continuous interpretation of the best available information, and that information keeps changing. And of course, there are different interpretations as well. Somehow people think that historians must all agree, but look at television any night and you'll see that we can't even agree on what happened yesterday. So why do you expect historians to agree on what happened 3,000 years ago? So the most interesting thing about Indian history, despite all this contestation, I think the real thing that is happening is that maybe a few, but wouldn't learn anything about major kingdoms like the Chalukyas, the the Vijayanagar Empire. You would learn very little about major characters in history like Martanda Varma or the Ahoms who ruled over Assam for some 600 years. So there's been serious problems with our history narrative. So I would argue that if you, as you said, were somebody who came from outside and wanted to get a perspective of history, I would say you should really read widely, discount much of the interpretation, but if you're really interested in it, go and pick out a lot of the original stuff that is there. I mean, the good thing is that a lot of this thing is just freely lying around. I mean, you can actually literally go and see Ashoka's edicts yourself and make up your mind about him.
So before I come to the process of going back and how you do it, since you're not a professional historian, since you don't sit in a university and go through, sit in a library, what you just said, the word rewriting, you said that you being accused of some kind of right-wing conspiracy. Why does there have to be, isn't the word rewriting somewhat problematic when you yourself are saying that this is all a question of interpretation, and you're really just, arguing for broadening the lens?
So I am arguing that it should be continuously rewritten based on emerging new evidence, like any other field of study. After all, when you find new information in any scientific field, do you not revise your theories?
But history it's not quite like science, right?
No, this is what I'm contesting.
Okay.
I am saying that why is history not like any other field of study? It is about evidence, which, by the way, as I keep saying, keeps changing. Why then should we not take whatever it is and different perspectives? By the way, even in science, even the same evidence is contested in various ways, and then a theory is proposed, new evidence comes and it is tested against it. Why should it not be done in history as well? I mean, it is the process that of any scholarship should progress through. So why not history? And any attempt to proceed down this path somehow is taken as some sort of a great act of heresy. So I actually have a real problem with this entire line of thought. And of course, this is not only true of history. Max Planck once said, science progresses one funeral at a time. So in some ways, perhaps that is true of history as well.
So what's your process then? How do you, as I said, not an academic historian, what's your process of going about and doing this? Why did you tell us about how you started down this road?
I'm not an academic historian, absolutely right. I started down this path not because I was particularly in love with history as a child or anything like that. I was like many other school kids who read their history because they had to. We lose. Battle of Buxar, we lose. Now, surely, since we are still around, we must have won some battles. So I began to investigate this, and I discovered that, interestingly, the colonial era historians had deliberately wiped out all mention of battles in which the Indians had won. This has been actually done systematically and relentlessly. People do not realize this, because there are many battles in which Indians won over thousands of years, of course. So once I began to investigate this, I began to see it's quite interesting. So, for example, the European colonizers wanted us to feel that we were always under some other ruler from outside who came and ruled us. So you will get the impression that, say, the Mughals ruled us, and then a little later the British ruled us. They will not tell you that in the middle there were some 75 odd years when the Marathas ruled over most of India. And they have been wiped out of the memory because it didn't fit this narrative. So, on the other hand, if you travel around India, you will see lots of evidence of Marathas everywhere. Even Delhi was ruled by the Marathas for several decades. So, nobody talks about the Maratha period of Delhi. And of course, they are scattered all over India. So, this is quite incredible that you have wiped out these things. And then when it began to cause a certain amount of dissonance in my head, so I began to go back and read the stuff myself. And so as a result of this process, I began to arrive at somewhat different view of things. And this is also true, by the way, not just of recent events, but going back over time. So you have, for example, Samudragupta, who was one of the founders of he was the second emperor of the Gupta dynasty. You read in our history books that he was the Napoleon of India. So I said, why Napoleon of India? Why not Julius Caesar of India? Why not Peter the Great of India? After all, he was one of the greatest generals of his time in the world. I mean, he fought many, many battles and seems never to have lost. He basically reconquered all of the subcontinent. So I then discovered the reason he's called Napoleon is because British historians wanted to tell us that, yes, he was a great general, but remember, we defeated Napoleon. So they were subliminally adding this into our memory. And it is systematic and relentless. Now, of course, I have gone and, of course, here I've been mocking colonial era historians, but let me tell you, this is also true of post-independence history.
I was going to ask, yeah.
Yes, so you have this odd thing that the Congress politicians, having come to power after independence, essentially wiped out of our memory the memory of alternative streams of the freedom struggle. For example, the revolutionaries. And, there is a story to be told that it was the revolutionaries and not the Gandhian non-violence that led us to freedom. And there is many well-known commentators of that time, including very famously Ambedkar, who made this case that, it was really the revolutionaries, starting with the Ghadar movement, and even before the Ghadar movement, through the interwar period, the INA, the naval revolt of 1946 that led to independence, and that it had nothing to do with hanging around the beach making salt.
Nothing to do?
Yes, very little anyway.
So isn't this just that those who are in the ascendancy and those who are in power in the academy, power in government, wherever, they write...
Yes, nothing unique with that, but nothing unique with that.
And isn't that what's happening now?
Yes, but so what?
Or not so
what? The point I'm making to you is that...
You concede that that's the
So the point I'm making is the history is... Why is a introduction of a different narrative somehow scandalous when the history that has been inherited is already full of these biases? So let us agree on some things, that the history that we have inherited is nothing sacrosanct about it. The thing that we need to debate, if we want to have is about the evidence. And that I think is a fair thing. We have all got a right to our opinion and interpretation. We do not have a right to our facts. So I think it is a fair point that we have a debate about the evidence. And so I am a great votary, and that's why I told you right in the beginning, we need to have seriousness about the evidence. Then any reasonable interpretation of that history is fair. But to say that in any way interfering with this mainstream story is sacrilege, I have a problem with that.
It's not sacrilege, but you would admit that what is going on is because certain forces...
Well, you depend certain forces. Why do you have to be so coy about it? Fact of the matter is, there is a government in place may have a different view, but there is, the way you have framed it is by saying somehow that their view of history is somehow wrong, and the view that we have inherited is somehow right. I'm just saying to you, why is that history somehow not kosher?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that, so you would admit that the government...
I'm not admitting, I'm saying, when you say admit means that there's something wrong and I'm admitting to a sin. You admit to sins. I'm just saying that there is a problem with the history.
I'm not sure about that. So you admit that you began at the beginning by saying that this is not that you were accused of being part of some right-wing project. And
no,
so,
the point of the
all I'm saying is that yes, you are. And so there's nothing wrong with that at all.
No, I'm saying that I am a part of rewriting it. I may have a right-wing view, which is maybe fair. Yeah. I'm just pointing out to you, so what?
Nothing at all.
Yeah.
I'm saying you distanced yourself from it earlier. But so talking about that, let's say, the current moment that we're in. If you were a historian 100 years from now, 500 years from now, how would you write the history of today?
That's a tricky one, because there are two things about history. And this is something, by the way, it goes down to the core of how I think about history. So I'm now going to switch a little bit to think the philosophy of history that, by the way, is there very much in all my writings. That's something, so I'm going to bore you a little bit with my philosophy of history. So my view of the world is that it is inherently a complex system, and those of you who are familiar with complexity theory will know this, that I look at the world as something that can go in multiple directions at any point in time. So unlike a Marxist view of history, which has a very much more a predicted path of history, a deterministic part of history, my view of history is that at any point it can go in different directions. Now, when you have this view of history, the problem is that history writing by its nature is that somebody later on tells you about the causation, the line of causation that led to a certain chain of events, right? That's what history writing is about. Now, that's all very good when you're looking backwards. When you're looking, as you stand now, looking forwards, it's a very difficult thing to do. And that's why I would be very, very, I would say, all I can say is we can record what we thought is going on, but we cannot actually write a true history. And just to give you an example of this, so if you were here in the Indian Ocean world in the 15th century, what would happen is that you would take the view that the world was going to be taken over by the Chinese. Why? You had these massive voyages led by Admiral Zheng He coming through from China into the Indian Ocean world and basically knocking out anybody else who was getting in the way. So if you were in 1430 or 1440, you would say, the next several centuries would be Chinese dominated. But what happens is that the Admiral Zheng He incidentally was a eunuch. And the eunuchs in the Chinese court were very, very powerful. And a new emperor came to the throne, and he was backed by the Mandarin bureaucrats who were suspicious of the eunuchs. So what happens is that they, being good bureaucrats, do the obvious thing. They switch off the money to the Navy. And the Chinese Navy basically goes into a nosedive, and in fact its records are all suppressed till the end of the 20th century. So the Chinese, having come into the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century, knocking out everybody else, had suddenly withdrawn. And this is the vacuum that was left when Vasco da Gama turned up in the Indian Ocean. And this is the reason the Europeans managed to conquer the Indian Ocean region so quickly, because the Chinese had been there and knocked out everybody else and left a vacuum. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because ex ante, it was impossible to have predicted that this was what was happening. If I was sitting in 1430, 1440, trying to predict forward what was happening, I would simply not have guessed this. And so, that is the reason I am somewhat skeptical about the ability of those who are participating in the events being able to fully be able to gauge the purport of what they are actually doing. Because since my theory is, complexity theory is all about unintended consequences, butterfly effects, etc., I have no idea which butterfly is flapping its wings right now.
So you need time. You need distance.
You can only know with distance.
So one of your books is called The Indian Renaissance.
Yes.
And when we were talking about the panel earlier, we talked a little bit about this. The way you present it is that you use the word rewriting, broadening the lens,
Yes.
and ushering some kind of renaissance in this area. Isn't there a worry that renaissance is a word to which we attach positive connotations, but there's also revivalism, which sometimes finds its expression in some very violent political movements as well? Isn't there a worry that that's what happens with this sometimes? How do you, because it's not, I know it's not black and white.
It's not.
But that what you do and the project that you're setting out on.
So one of the things that I'm interested in is, and this is relates to my very first book I think you were talking about, is the Indian Renaissance. The point I'm making there is, a moment comes in history when it basically, that's the intellectual milieu of that society begins to liquefy and begins to break out. And interestingly, this happened at multiple points in time in other countries' histories. The word Renaissance is very often used for the European Renaissance coming out of the Middle Ages. So let's take that as an example, and then I'll come to more recent times. One of the interesting things that happens at that time is, of course, that coming out of the sort of the caged intellectual milieu of the Middle Age, controlled by the church and so on, the sudden expansion of knowledge because of printing, for example. And you see this happening in multiple places. So what is interesting about a Renaissance is that it doesn't happen in any silo. So today we think of, Venice, or you think of Florence as places to go and look at art. But in fact, Florence and Venice were not about art. They were about commerce. The Florentines were basically bankers. The Venice was a place of commerce. The great invention, if you had gone at that time to Venice in the 14th century and asked them what was their great invention, they would have talked about joint stock companies. Or gone to Florence, they would talk about double entry bookkeeping rather than art. So what happens is that there's multiple areas, it's sort of an opening of mind that happens, and a lot of energy shows through in commerce, it happens in art, it happens in politics, it's also new kinds of writing happens in literature, in warfare as well. So it is a time of energy, and yes, it manifests itself in all kinds of things. So my argument is that this is an energetic period. How it again pans out, I have no way to predict, because I am myself of the view that history is inherently unpredictable. But I do feel that we may be living through one of those periods where this is happening. That after maybe 1,000 years, maybe a little bit less than that, maybe 800 years of being sort of, and it's not a straight line, but certainly in decline, certainly as economically being in decline, but in many other ways as also being in decline. We are now going through a period in recent decades of rapidly opening out in multiple fields. So you're seeing that in literature, new kinds of writing are beginning to happen. Something like even this festival is a part of that. We are seeing that in the economic field. We are seeing that new kinds of films that are coming out and experimentation. And that energy is there. And yes, that energy can manifest itself in multiple ways. I have no way ex ante to predict it.
But do you think, have you been surveying what has happened? I'm not asking you to look forward.
So as I said, my entire theory of history is the inability of humans to predict forward. But I am a great believer that that is one of the key reasons, and I have tweeted about this, written about it as well, is the constitutional set of rules of game are very, very important as a result. Because this is about the churn, and one of my books is called The Ocean of Churn. Since I am a big believer in continuous churning, whether it's in the economic field, social field, or of ideas, I believe that we need to have some agreed rules of the game. And at this point in history in our country, that agreed rules of the game is the Constitution. Now, obviously, the Constitution is not entirely set in stone. It also evolves. But by and large, it is something that is slow-moving, is by and large agreed upon. Democracy is another way through which we go through the churn. These ideas flow through. And that's why I am very suspicious of attempts by, for example, established elites to stifle arguments that they feel uncomfortable with. And we have seen that in India, particularly over the last 70 years, that ideas that the elite found uncomfortable, that was uncomfortable in India International Center, was consequently thought of being something that has to be brushed aside and demonized in many ways. And I have a problem with that. I think I'm, by and large, except for incitement of violence, I am a believer in freedom of speech.
But do you think, I mean, but coming back to the question, the distinction between Renaissance and Revivalism. Revivalism is often accompanied by that sort of violence because the
I would argue Revivalism means what? If you are thinking of Revivalism as some attempt to go back to some pristine ancient past.
An imagined past.
An imagined past, or whatever you may say. Maybe there is a problem with that. But on the other hand, to say, in the same breath, that somehow one cannot be proud of one's ancient past is also a problem. So let me take you down the path you're probably hinting at. I have a real problem with going and making arguments about flying Vedic chariots, especially since, as far as I can tell, there's no proof of any. But on the other hand, I also have a problem with the equivalent on the other side of the political divide, which is to deny the achievements of ancient India, which is true. For example, in surgery, much of modern surgery actually turns up in Shushrut. Plastic surgery is genuinely an Indian invention. Modern plastic surgery in Europe is actually directly derived, and this matter is fully documented, from Indian surgery. There's a large amount of mathematics that is derived from Indian surgery. There's a huge amount of contributions in ancient India genuinely had in terms of navigation and spreading Indian ideas to the rest of the world, all the way from Rome, all the way to China and Japan. So my view is that this is the real problem, is this debate is happening without evidence. And I keep coming back to this business of evidence, because if you do not anchor this argument with evidence, then it is up in the air. But to say that, we should ignore the evidence because, it will be revivalist and so on, is itself, in fact, leads to in fact, it feeds both these. Not just that. Yeah. This is exactly what leads to these claims of Vedic flying chariots. It's driven by the other side.
So I mentioned at the beginning that you haven't just written non-fiction books. You also wrote a book of fiction, short stories. Given your preoccupations as a historian, how did that inform your fiction?
I'm not preoccupied as a historian at all. Let me just point out, my books come in all kinds. I've written extensively on economics. I've written on urban design. In fact, my very latest book, which is called India and the Age of Ideas, is 1/3 about culture, 1/3 about urban design, and 1/3 about economics. So I'm not preoccupied. In fact, I tend to have a problem with the whole idea of dividing fields up into silos because of this complexity theory view of the world, because everything impacts everything. So coming
how
back,
did it impact
fiction? So when I come into fiction, I would argue that fiction in its own way tells the truth in a different way. So incidentally, I write satire. So the way satire works is that you take real life and you try and present it in a super real way to the extent that it begins to look absurd. So that is why I have attempted to use, so in that sense, you could argue that my satire is a record of my times. I'm mocking it, but the only reason that mocking works is because in some way I have tried to be more true to real life than real life itself is. That's how satire would work. So in that sense, it is also not non-fiction. It is not fiction entirely. It is in some ways non-fiction too. And it's also true of, by the way, other writers. When you think about Victorian England, Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle are in some ways more true of the feel of the Victorian era than maybe if you just read newspaper reports or something of that kind.
So how do you think that's informed the historical imagination in India?
Fiction?
Yeah.
Well, of course it has. When we think about the Gupta period, for example, we read Kalidasa. Now, one doesn't have to literally take everything Kalidasa is writing as truth, but we get a sense of what was their aesthetics, what was their attitudes towards various social issues. The same thing come out of the epics, for example. Itihasa, the word Itihasa literally means this is as it happened. While I do not literally think that the facts as the epics today we have are literally true, they may have been inspired originally by actual events. Very difficult to tell how much, because the texts that we have inherited have lots of interpolations. So, but they are Itihasa in a different way, because they record our thoughts, our attitudes at various points in time. And so in that sense, they are also informing our history. So reading Kalidasa also informs our history. Reading Charles Dickens also informs our history. If you, for example, I think in some ways the best story about partition is Manto's story called Toba Tek Singh, right? It is completely fiction. It's also satire, incidentally. But it captures the complete absurdity of that moment beautifully. So fiction is in many ways more true than non-fiction, except if you begin to take it too literally, that's a different matter. But certainly the essence of it can very often be more true.
And so, I mean, and how do you think that's evolved? So there's this professional history project that you've been talking about, sort of going back, rewriting. Do you see that in fiction?
You mean rewriting fiction?
Well, not rewriting, but the way fiction is approaching this country, the representation
I have found it way too serious. I think the point is, most important thing about fiction is to read it to have fun. I am highly suspicious of literary criticism because my view is that literary criticism creates critics, it doesn't create writers. In fact, those of you who have read one of my satire books called The Intellectuals, one of my stories called The Intellectuals, where it mocks Kolkata intellectuals sitting in a coffee shop, dissecting the world and presenting these absurd papers on post-colonialism. And I find that kind of strange because they are sort of trapped in this universe. So I would say the most important thing about fiction is to read it, to enjoy it. And incidentally, that is also taken about our history. We need to understand our history to understand ourselves, yes. But again, I think the most important thing about reading history is to enjoy reading it. Like with everything, taking it too seriously has its own drawbacks.
Another story mocks festivals such as this.
Yes, that's right.
So
I do expect somebody to stand up in the end and to ask give a short speech disguised as a question.
So tell me about your next project. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, the revolutionaries and the independence movement. Tell us a little bit about it, a little bit more about it, elaborate on how you're going about writing it.
So, I have two projects. One of them is to try and actually get some of my writings, and maybe the writings of others, into Indian languages. One of the problems and I'm going to come, so there are two projects. One is my own writings, but one is to actually get more translations into Indian languages. Indians are very proud of the Indian language, of their languages, but one of the things they do is to want to somehow fossilize them into some Sahitya Academy kind of thing. Now, this is killing our languages, I'm telling you, because there is no new material in our languages. So if you read textbooks of your kids, for example, or those who are young enough actually have suffered them relatively recently. How many times can you read Prem Chand's Eidgah? So I am very interested in creating new material in Indian languages. Well, one step into that is to actually get my own books translated into Indian languages, and with the help of Westland Amazon, which is my, and Sudha here will give me some of my books. Just a second. The print is Eka, I'm told, and this is a Hindi translation of Ocean of Churn. It's called Manthan Ka Sagar, but it's in Hindi. I've got in Marathi. Several of my books are now in Malayalam, Tamil, and so on. And the idea here is to get new material into Indian languages. Any language is alive if the idea is coming into it. There are ideas expressed in that language. So unfortunately, Indian writers the writers in Indian languages are particularly excited about having their languages translated into, say, English. But that's great for English. That doesn't do anything for their own language. If there's not enough material coming into that language, there's not enough new ideas coming into that language will not thrive. So try this out yourself. Go into any Indian language section of any bookshop. First of all, they are very, very limited. But the places where you may see somewhat larger selections will be like railway stations, A.H. Wheeler in Allahabad, which I just visited. And the thing is, almost all the books were written years ago, 50 years ago. So it's the same Premchand, the same Yashpal is still being... So unless there is new writing, so I am very, very keen on this. And that new writing has to be something interesting and fun. It has to be science fiction. It has to be detective novels. I mean, Bengali, for example, my mother tongue, you had a great tradition of writing detective novels. Satyajit Ray, by the way, was a great writer of detective novels and many other things. Of fun poetry. His father was of satirical poetry. But now, who is today's Satyajit Ray? Who is today's Tagore? Who is today's Manto? And you'll be amazed. I ask this of Indian language writers very often. And they'll name, he's a great writer and that writer. I said, no, wait. Name me in your language, since you're the expert in that language, who is the writer below the age of 40 who is likely to become Manto or Tagore? After all, when Tagore was 40, he was already famous. So who is your Tagore today or likely to become? And I have so far, in 5 or 6 years of asking this question, not managed to get an answer, which really worries me about Indian languages. So this is one project that I am...
And now my answer, so the Independence Project.
Yes, so the other project that I have is to write and yes, I'll use the word rewrite, the history of the independence movement from the perspective of the revolutionaries. And by the way, the revolutionaries were not the only other alternative to the Indian National Congress. There were peasant revolts, there were many other movements going on as well, and they were interacting with each other. This too was a complex interaction. But I'm going to talk specifically about the revolutionaries because you get the impression from our conventional narratives that there were these brave individuals, maybe Bhagat Singh or Raj Bihari Bose or Chandrasekhar Azad or Subhash Bose, whoever, and they did some individual acts of bravery along the way, and that didn't really add up to anything. So yes, brave acts, but frankly, didn't really contribute anything to freedom. This is absolutely not true, because they were actually a part of an organized movement that survived and sustained itself over half a century. And it was not just in India, they had embassies internationally. So in the First World War, not the Second World War, in the First World War, the revolutionaries had embassies in California, in Berlin, in Tokyo. And many of these same characters pop up through this 50-year period. So I'll give you the example of Raj Bihari Bose. In the First World War, Raj Bihari Bose and a granduncle of mine called Sachindranath Sanyal, they both attempted to cause a revolt in the Indian army called the Gadar movement. It failed. Now, these guys then turned up in the Second World War and they attempted to do the same thing. And this same thing was the Indian National Army in Singapore. And this Indian National Army that was set up in Singapore was not set up by Netaji. It was set up by the same guy, Raj Bihari Bose, who had fled to Tokyo in the interwar period, had turned up in the Second World War, and set up this. So he was very old by this time, so he handed over control to Netaji. But I'm just telling you that this was a very large movement with huge international linkages, and in fact, even understanding the actions of the Indian National Congress can only be understood in the context of how they were reacting to these characters. And of course, it all culminates into a major revolt in the Indian Navy in Mumbai in 1946. Again, I actually didn't know about this revolt till I was an adult. It's only in my 20s happened to be living in Kolaba in Mumbai. I bumped into this very small memorial and began researching it. And then I suddenly realized, oh my God, this is a major, major event. And of course, at that time, you couldn't Google things up quite so easily. So I actually had to learn about it the hard way. But then it suddenly, many, many things begin to fall in place. And so I think this story needs to be told. I think it's a valid story. And it's a perspective that is different. And just going back to the point you were making, after independence, unfortunately, almost all the top leaders of this movement had been killed or died. And so, or at least in the case of Netaji, he had disappeared. And so consequently, the power came to one group. And they wrote their story in one way. Now my view is, why can that story not be challenged?
So, since we've gone back to the beginning of our conversation, this is a question which I guess I could have asked then as well, but I'll ask you this and then we'll ask the audience for questions. Just the idea of India, when we talk about India, you talked about we need to revisit our history, rewrite it. Yes. That itself is contested, isn't it? Is India post 47? Where do you date that from? How do you approach that?
So I think the idea of India is an old one, and I have a problem with some people who come up with this thing that there is an idea of India, an Nehruvian idea of India, and any break from that is somehow a bad form. Now I mean that is ridiculous. Did the people who were sort of sacrificing themselves for the independence movement, dying for an India that didn't exist? Obviously not. They had a conception of India. True, this conception of India has changed over time. And at every point in time, there have been many ideas of India. There has been a civilizational idea of India. There is a geographical idea of India. There is a political idea of India. The way it has manifested itself today is the Republic of India as it stands. But even there is a civilizational idea of India that exists together with it. So if you look at our constitution, it says, India that is Bharat. It starts with those words. Why? It is not the case that the word Bharat is merely a Hindi translation of India. No. Then if that was the case, then the Hindi version of the constitution would have started with Bharat and the English version would have had only India. That is not the case. It starts with India that is Bharat. Clearly this idea of a Republic of India and simultaneously a civilizational India coexist and have existed in some ways for a very long time, and we are not even unique in this. So if you go back and look at Greek history, for example, now the ancient Greeks were fighting with each other all the time. There were small kingdoms and republics. That doesn't mean that they didn't have a sense of civilizational history.
So can you give us an example from the past that exemplifies this?
Yes. So for example, you take the Puranas, the Vishnu Puran clearly mentions the idea of India. It says, south of the snowy mountains but north of the great deep ocean, there live the descendants of the Bharatas. So it has a conception. Then it describes the rivers and the mountains. So, and in those mountains, it describes the mountains not just of the Himalayas, but also the eastern Ghats, the western Ghats. It mentions the Vindhyas and so on. It mentions the rivers Kaveri, but it also mentions the Indus, it mentions the Ganga. There is a landscape that it mentions, and this landscape is a civilizational idea very much embedded in many, many places. So for example, when you do a Havan or you take a holy dip, there is a chant which mentions the 7 rivers, the Sapta Sindhu. Now that Sapta Sindhu is interesting, and I'll come back to it why this is interesting. That Sapta Sindhu mentions 7 rivers, and those are 7 rivers it mentions Kaveri, it mentions Ganga, it mentions Saraswati, which has disappeared. It mentions Narmada. So there is a geography of India, and Dayanayak also talks about it, how India is linked through its pilgrimages. Shankaracharya, for example, 8th century, he crisscrosses India and he sets up these mutts. They are not randomly scattered around. There's one in the east, there's one in the west, there's one in the north, one in the south. So this conception of India as a civilizational unit is a very old one. Why should we deny it? That doesn't mean that it is an unchanging idea of India. That idea of India has changed over time. In fact, it has changed right from the beginning. The term Bharat originally comes up in the Rig Veda, only alludes to one tribe in Haryana. And when they were talking about the Sabda Sindhu, they were talking about the Saraswati and its tributaries, so very small area. Over a period of time, it had expanded over a much bigger area. Now, if you come to the medieval period, when people are talking about, they began to talk about Jambu Dvipa. The Jambu Dvipa became then the conception of a subcontinent. But it's quite interesting that when the Indian word for barbarians or somebody who's outside of the Indian civilization is the word Mlecha. Okay? Now, Indians were trading with Southeast Asia. It's quite interesting. They call these people the Nagas, but the Nagas are never called the Mlechas. They are clearly within the civilization. So it is very interesting that therefore a medieval Indian would have considered Southeast Asia as part of India. And this is not something that we are only thinking. If you go to Southeast Asia, look at Indonesia. It's a Muslim majority country, becomes independent in 1949. What does it do? It calls itself Indonesia. It's named after us. It calls its currency rupiah. Its national symbol is the Garuda. So even they may have changed their religion, but they have continued to have very strong links to our civilization. And in fact, I asked an Indonesian how they thought about this. And he gave me a very interesting answer. He was an Indonesian Muslim who told me this. Look, we have changed the way we pray, but we have not changed our ancestors.
So on that note, can I ask for questions from the audience? Does anybody have questions for Sanjeev? Right there.
Yeah, you talked in the beginning about how history has been written about all the wars that we have lost. And you've also covered that you'd like to retell or rewrite the way the revolutionaries have created history. What about military history? What do you have to say about that, and why isn't it been so popular? Because we have won 2 wars. We've liberated a country. And
I'm not the expert on military history, so I write my history from much more an economic and geographical perspective than from a military perspective. I'm not the expert on military, but it obviously pops up everywhere in my writings. But I agree. There are many problems with military history. One of them is that we simply wiped out in the colonial period all the military history which was inconvenient. So it is only because of this recent movie that we began to learn about Baji Rao. He's one of the great generals of the 18th century. In fact, was a far more successful general than Napoleon. Samudragupta certainly was a more successful. But I'll tell you about, there were Indian generals which are unknown in India who had major impact on world history. And I'll give you one example. Martanda Varma. Okay? Now, Martanda Varma is important for the following reason. You see, in the early 18th century, the Dutch East India Company was the most powerful global economic military machine. And they had basically taken over what is now Indonesia, they had taken over southern Africa, they had taken over Sri Lanka, and there was very good reason that they were going to take over India. And they were in fact attempting to take over Kerala when they came upon a local king called Martanda Varma in Kerala, who defeated the Dutch in a battle called the Battle of Kolachal in the early 1730s. And as a result of the defeat, the Dutch East India Company went into decline, and the English East India Company and the French East India Company came to the fore. So he had a major impact on world history. Not just that. After that defeat, no Asiatic power would defeat a European power till 1905 when the Japanese defeated the Russians. Now everybody in the world who has any interest in history knows that the Japanese defeated the Russians in 1905 and that had major political connotations. But nobody remembers poor Martanda Varma, who had been the last guy to have done that and had actually changed the course of history. In fact, but for Martanda Varma, I would perhaps be giving you this talk in Dutch. So there is a lot to be said, but of course, you alluded to post-independence history. And even there, it's quite interesting that just now we have one movie on the surgical strikes, but there are no movies made on 1971 war. It's incredible. Why? Why is this? And why just about the victories? We can also have storytelling about our defeats. Why not about 1962? And one of the problems there is that those, unfortunately, who came to become our intellectual those who became the intellectuals after independence, unfortunately the intellectual space of India was not interestingly captured, maybe with some contributions from the INC, but for the most part the intellectuals, the space of India after independence was captured largely by people who had been collaborators with the British. It'll shock you actually, this is a history to be written in its own right. And in many ways they were not particularly comfortable with revivalism, as you said. So one has to look at who were the historians after independence, who were the intellectuals after independence. And very often you will find that those who were writing our histories had very troubled links to that history, including military history. So the fact that Prannath Thapar was the army chief during the 1962 debacle has a lot to be said about the fact that that entire episode cannot now be written about.
Cannot be written about. Any more?
Yeah, so I have a question related to ancient Indian history. So we see mention of the Yavanas or the Indo-Hellenistic Greek tribes who were, I think, offshoots of Alexander the Great's invasion. We see their mention till the Mauryan Empire or say even the early Gupta period. After that, they just vanish. So do you think the invasion of Islam, the rising foot of Islam was responsible for that? And why did India cut trade ties with the transoxal plain in Central Asia?
First of all, they didn't. There was a lot of trade going on right up to now, till the 18th century. If you go to Baku, there is a Atishgah there where people were trading right up to the Indian traders were there until the 19th century. So there was a lot of trade happening all through with Central Asia right into modern times. But what was the first question? Sorry, I blinked up. The use of the word Yavana. Yes, the word Yavana, which by the way derives from the term Ionian, and means Greek in a very rough sense, is widely used up to the medieval period, but it means many things at different points in time. In the very early period, it means literally the Greeks. Then later on, it is more loosely used to deal with the Indo-Greeks. But it continues to also be used for the Greeks. Remember, while northern India may have been dealing with invasions with the Indo-Greeks, much of southern India was trading with the Greeks of the Mediterranean. So these are generically used. And so this term continues to be used. And also interestingly, here, I'd like to say that one of the things you learn from reading ancient history is that people identified people by their civilizational link, not by their racial link. It's quite stunning. So people would say that these people are Greeks. When they said they are Greeks, they meant that they were people not necessarily Greek origin, but of culturally Greek in some fashion. So, for example, when the Eastern Mediterranean gets taken over by the Greek Orthodox Church, this term begins to mean people who believe in the Greek Orthodox. Yavana means those Greek Orthodox Church. So now, when the Ethiopians become Orthodox Church, take the Greek Orthodox Church, the term Krishna Yavana or black Greek is used for the Ethiopians. So this term Ethiopian means many things at different points in time, and it continues to be used as long as there is this exchange of some sort with them. But by the late medieval period, there is almost the Arabs basically almost put a blockade of information and flow between the European world and the Indic world. And so consequently the term Yavana becomes a term of memory rather than of current usage.
One more? Right at the front.
See, what my one question is...
Oh, we'll come to you next if you don't mind. Yeah.
You see, you have said about Indonesia and how our culture spread to Angkor Wat in Cambodia and Bali and other places. But there is no history in the real sense written so far about all these things, and culturally we were so, but we became weaker and weaker in the
So actually
years
there
to
is
come.
history written about them. Those countries write their history very clearly. Lots of inscriptions are there. And as it happens to be, since you're interested in it, you can read about it from an Indian perspective in my book called Ocean of Churn, which explicitly gets into this whole issue about these empires of Southeast Asia, whether of the Chams, the Angkor, or Srivijaya and the Majapahit. There's plenty of history written. So I don't think it's true that this history has not been written. It's not been written in India, but let me say, even if I have to plug my own book, I have written extensively on it in my own books. Yeah.
Taught in schools.
Yes, it has not been
That
taught
is
in
my
schools
point.
because it doesn't fit the narratives that need to be told. And this is one of the points I'm trying to make. Yeah.
I hope
Here
I
and then,
won't
yeah.
be your last man to give this speech. You know, you said somebody will give a speech instead of a question. I hope it won't be me. Trying my level best to resist that point. Now, history is always written by the victors, that all of us know. Where you spoke about Greece, where you have been recently. It's the same thing out there. The point I'm trying to make is, you cannot rewrite history from when a new political party comes into power in a democracy. Tomorrow you might have, Congress party coming back and then saying whatever the BJP has written, because that's how it will be looked at, even though you may not be having the hue of BJP or Congress or any particular party as such.
And your question?
And the question is, this kind of rewriting of history may not last long if it's going to have a political tint. Whenever...
The question.
Yeah, like it's only you talked about only the victors of rights history. Well, only all military battles, you said only when they are won, they are written. Like the British, for example, they love. Yeah.
So
my question is, political point is one. Two, the second point, they are trying to rewrite your point about, some countries, they do glorify losses, like the charge of Light Brigade, Dunkirk, things like that. My primary question is, if we try to rewrite history in this year, new party comes into power, the whole thing could be washed out.
So my own view is, why should we perpetuate, since we are afraid that new views will come in, why should we perpetuate the lies of the past? The first point is, why should we perpetuate the lies of the past because you're scared that the new biases will come in? So I don't think that is a tenable argument of any kind. What I will say is that let us allow for different views to be there. Let us at least agree on the evidence. So the debate, let there be debate. Why should there not be debate? After all, we debate what happened yesterday on television channels every night. So if we cannot agree on what happened yesterday, why do you expect historians to agree on what happened 1,000 years ago? I am therefore comfortable with different views being there. All I'm trying today, let us be honest about two things. One, that what is the evidence, and the fact that this what is the evidence, let's be honest about it. We can interpret it differently. And I have a problem in India. Unfortunately, there is no honesty about the evidence either. Two, let us also be honest about the fact that history can be seen in different ways, from different lenses. And by the way, you're spending a lot of time talking about political lenses. By the way, there are other lenses too. You can take geographical lenses. For example, why are we writing our history only from the perspective of Delhi? That's a problem I have. I have written maritime history. Why should history only be written from a land perspective? You can take history from a scientific perspective. How about writing the history of the science? How about writing history as a geographical sense? One of my books is called The Land of Seven Rivers. It's a geographical history of India, which talks about history from the perspective of how cities rose and fell, how our rivers changed, how our wildlife changed. So history can be written in multiple ways. There is none of those are any more true than the other. I am just saying, let us first give up this primacy of one political narrative just because it happens to be the one that's in our textbook. I don't see why that is somehow sacrosanct. I am challenging that. Two, I want to say that there are different ways of life. Let's accept it. Three, we need to have a serious debate about evidence. And by the way, we need to invest in evidence gathering. I mean, it's extraordinary how few of our archaeological sites are being properly looked after or are being redug. We are still running, most of our engine is still running on, the fact, for all my criticism of colonial period, the fact is those fellows at least dug up things and looked at them.
Let's have one more quick question.
Yeah, my question is, how do you think comics and graphic novels inform the historical imagination? because as children, say in India, you read Amar Chitra Katha, that kindles an interest in history. And that may not be factual at a later stage or subject to academic rigor. And second, I attended a session by Mr. Bibek Debroy. So he was talking about the Puranas. Now you mentioned Jambudvip. Now in some Puranas, that Jambudvip covers the geographical expanse of the entire world. So can that be considered a legitimate source? Thanks.
So of course you have got to take a reasonable view of things. By the way, comics are an important part of historical imagination. You'll be surprised, Amar Chitra Kathas are actually better researched than you think. I have found very often that many of our very well-known historians make mistakes that I have corrected them using references I found in Amar Chitra Katha. In the first page they used to give their references, if you remember, and I use those references. So don't sniff, put your nose up at Amar Chitra Katha. It is an important source of historical memory for an entire generation, as indeed maybe movies be or videos be in the future. So I have no problem with that. There are many ways of knowing about history. He actually had another question. Sorry, what was the other question he had?
About the Purana.
Yes, about Puranas. Now again, you have to be careful. You see, the Puranas have some historical evidence. They have king lists. They also have philosophical talks. One cannot take it all literally. One has to triangulate to figure out how much of it is true. And incidentally, we do this all the time in other parts of the world. For example, if you take Herodotus, who is taken by Western historians as the father of history writing, right? Now you read his Herodotus, it's full of absurdities. For example, he talks about India and he says India has these gigantic ants that dig for gold. That's completely absurd. Now, obviously, but that doesn't mean Herodotus doesn't have any interesting historical evidence in it. So we have to dig in there, triangulate with archaeology and other sources, and what seems absurd and what seems reasonable, and make some guess at what may be the case. And then we have to test those theories or whatever hypothesis against new evidence, as it turns out, as we do indeed in science. So my view is that this is a perfectly interesting source of history to look at the Puranas, as long as you don't take them completely literally. But at the same time, I have some problem with the old approach that we inherited from the Europeans who said, oh, all of this is bunkum, there's nothing interesting in there. That is also not true. There is a lot of interesting stuff there in the Puranas that we can, and in fact, it has distinct king lists. And the later edges of those king lists are known fact. One of the reasons we discovered who Ashoka was, that he was the grandson of Chandragupta, is from a Puranic king list. And then we extrapolated and triangulated using other sources of information. So do not write off our own indigenous sources. And I have a real problem with this obvious dismissing of Indic sources when we are very happy to take, say, Xuanzang, who was a Chinese pilgrim, as being a gospel truth. Whereas if you read Xuanzang, he's full of fantastical things as well. And in fact, he was as it happens to be, those of you who read Xuanzang will know, he was a Buddhist bigot. And he saw everything from the perspective of extreme Buddhism. Why do we take him as being the gospel truth either?
Okay, on that note, and
there's one last question from the gentleman.
I think maybe
we have to stop. Okay.
I think we've been ordered off.
Sanjeev,
sorry. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sanjeev, for this chat.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks all.
Thank you so very much. Maybe they'll be there. You can have